Good evening and most welcome to Heidegger 889. It is progressing swiftly. I am quite amazed how far we've gone, and I would like to once more take up the text of Susie Froebel because it's so uniting for all the things that we studied before, and it resounds into different subjects, and knitting them together they become interactive and no longer separated as usually is the case. And I want to take up something that Kalle was interested in, autobiography, and I would let that set the ambience of the lecture. We start with a cite from Jacques Derrida himself. He'd be very happy to have read anything about Susie Froebel, her very good summation on where neurology has taken us. It's a cite from the book This Strange Institution Called Literature. What interests me today is not strictly called either literature or philosophy. Autobiography is perhaps the least inadequate name, because it remains for me the most enigmatic, the most open, even today. And this is one of those deconstructions I always like by Jacques Derrida. And it's like obliterating the difference between literature and philosophy. And also fact and fiction and other divisions that sort of hinder us and limit the thinking. This is fractality in motion. It seemed that Jacques Derrida had an uncanny intuition for how reality really worked. Somewhere in his youth he must have had a strike of insight that reverberated through his whole existence. And getting closer to understand this insight verbally as well, because he did never express it from Rudolf Cachet, and giving us the clues how to do it ourselves. Because it is a doing of sorts. It's not so much criticism, neither is it a description. It's a thing that disappears as soon as it's done. I think that would be a valid description of deconstruction. It doesn't alter, it doesn't go into the text, it gives us the possibility for a careful reading. Something that would have been blocked out with the text and us together, the formal reading or the conformal reading. Reality is fractal, non-linear, therefore passive biased reading is, and I haven't finished the line there because it is a lot of things. But it's not accurate. It is not what the author intended. And neither is it something that gives us anything. It's two things that doesn't fill up. Once we go in and try to read a text from a linear perspective, we won't get it. We won't get what the text is about. And this is what we are facing today. And it's a matter of not correct reading, but the level of reading. We can go deeper and deeper and deeper into the reading. And we do that by engaging ourselves when we read, when we see, when we do things. I wrote the following this morning. I was in a morning mood and it was before coffee, so it's a bit harsh. Now in the evening everything mellows up. Well, I will still read it today. The usual way of reading in this modern age is the reading of the ego. It's a shallow, non-penetrative reading, and it resembles how the Matryoshka is constructed, where each layer on a first look seem to be completely isolated from each other, separate, and can only be taken part by part. And when we open up the Matryoshka, we first take the outer surface away, and then we get another surface. And according to the myth of the ego, or the metaphysics of logocentrism, as Derrida would call it, we only have surfaces. The now, this very thin line, that is the now. I think it's an illustration would be the best. And I really need to start to illustrate the mirror a bit. So I will start to add graphic things to my lectures as much as I can, because this is something to feel, to understand visually, corporally, because this is three-dimensional as well. So we need to train our imagination. But it's a little bit, this now fixation is a thin line, and it takes its defining values from what is around it. I put minus here. And when it comes to the now, the defining lines are always its contradictions, the absence. So the now is the present, it's glorious, it's shining, is in his book Dissemination, it disseminates the text, gives it value, makes it fertile, makes it possible for it to grow into something full. It sounds a little bit like an illusion, and in some instances it is an illusion. It's something to get stuck in and worship almost. But it's not completely correct to say that either. You should take those descriptions with a pinch of salt, because we don't really have a choice either. And for something to be an illusion we cling to, there should be a choice somewhere, I always felt. So this is more of a choiceless illusion, and we have never opted to go into this way in some respects. This thing was already always established by the time we were born, but there is maybe a little thing there. Sometime maybe in your childhood you thought this was not correct. I think I actually did think that. I was thinking that somehow there is something underneath the text, something underneath what's said, and that the both levels, or several levels, were all true at the same time. And that's the alternative time thing that Susie Frobel sort of illustrates. Fractality is not like I am illustrating here, but this is just going to be a symbol for fractality. Now the odd thing with fractality, it doesn't allow for an understanding with this gestalt or perception of the world, because it is perception of the world. I do perceive things to be this way. This is a challenge to this way. It's not a criticism, it's a challenge, because for it to be challenged we need to understand the other one. So it's adding a possible knowledge that you can understand. Fractals are completely different, but they are the stuff of texts. 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 Everything is text, Derrida said. But it's also the stuff that the reader of text is made up of, because our consciousness as such is fractally. It's a fractal as well. It is an enormously complicated fractal. And fractals can only be, so to speak, understood, read, heard, seen, felt by something else that is also fractal. So fractality demands fractality in both ends. And this way at looking at things is very different from the regular way. The regular way is, if you remember this null point, it is an observer, put an O, and he is looking at the observed. And there is a huge division in between here. It's only one way. It comes from the observer to the observed, or from the subject to the object. It's only one way we perceive reality. Our neurons in this example are only receiver, taking in. And that is the idea also that is most current now in literature, oddly enough. We do not participate in the text. It's just both passive, as I mentioned before. It's also biased because we come in with a lot of presupposition before. We say, or we think, or we rather perceive this model, absence here, and that makes for a sharpness. So all the things that should come back from the object this way, this is blocked out. So there's a blockage here and taking away of things, which is a shame, because the thing that we perceive should be as close as possible. I think Kalle had some example this summer when we were in America, whenever it was. Somebody read a Bible text of some sort, and that person thought everything was a metaphor or something. And do you remember that?
Was it that somebody presented a paper who thought that everything is monosemic?
Yeah, it was that too, yeah. And everything was a metaphor for something else. And I got...
yes, the miracles. That,
yes,
for instance, the bishop in Skara thinks that, ordinary surgeon thinks that all the miracles are metaphors.
Yeah, it was something of the sort. And I got the feeling that the person who was reading this, he was reading it from a distant perspective. And you don't enter the text, you don't believe in what is said. And no one ever read anything like that, I would say, before 14th century, 15th century. It was a very weird way of reading, but it cannot have evolved by itself. Something must have caused it. It doesn't really make sense. It's like making oneself a bath and then not enter into the water. It's a very odd reading. And this is one of the obstacles. Susie Frobel mentions this. It is very hard to get away because this is so common today. We take it for granted. And I myself, I'm guilty as charged. I deem that to be the better way to read something. Not go into the text, not believe or being it. I had a metaphor then that you have to walk the text, you have to participate it. It's reading a book, for instance, could be fiction, non-fiction or whatever. It's a journey and you need to enter it wholehearted. If you don't do that, you won't enter the text. It's as simple as that. And this has to do with both sides being fractal. And there is a giving and taking, and there is no owning of the expression. There's no owning of the text or the content of what somebody's saying or a painting you see. You don't own the experience. This polarization model gives that gestalt, that perception, and then you will perceive it that way. And that's why I say it's so important I start to draw things, because it is very hard to speak about this. It is partly pre-ontological, it's pre-logic, it's pre-verbal in some instances. Describing it will help. It will put you on the right path, but it takes some drawing, some imagery. And the more three-dimensional you can make that, the better it is. For instance, the mirror given to me by Rodolphe Gachet was actually two-dimensional until just recently. This is because when I imagined the mirror, I didn't put myself into space. This might sound really odd. What on earth, if you put yourself in space, has nothing to do with the thing you imagine? Well, it actually does. In a fractal world, that has a quite considerable effect. And that's why fractality go so well hand in hand, both with neurology and deconstruction. They fit like the hand in the glove, perfect. And trust me, my hands are this small. If I find a glove that fits me, that's quite unusual. But I really did that now. This is fitting the glove to perfection. And all of a sudden, reading or understanding is absolute. There is an absolute necessity to take the subject into the equation and not talk about the subject just about like the reader or the one receiving the text. How he or she is feeling is of utmost importance. There's not some sort of side effect. This is division, this is taking a good part of reality out of the picture, and then simply you will not understand whatever it is. It's also this sense of before and after. What does that mean? Well, it means that I was looking for the eraser. No, never mind. We'll do with this piece of paper here. So that sharp divisioning is it's causing friction, and the cause of friction is that there is a third thing to this, and it's the a priori stuckedness that the subject somehow is in front of the object. It's looking at it, and mostly we say that the object shines to the subject this way. This is the receiver of experience or text or message, intention, whatever it is. And that is actually made before things. That is a double problem with that. The first problem is that it tells you what things are before you experience them. You bring in an idea that is so constrained that you won't see where it's there. You have an idea of things beforehand. That in itself is a problem. The second thing is, even if this were the case, and that could be the case actually, some instances most probably is, you will always set the dividing line somewhere in between in a way that you think is apt. The problem with that is it's not. You don't have the liberty of choosing. You need always, in this interface that Susanne Froebel calls it interface. Blakesley called that body map. Both these are constantly, according to the circumstances, to the rhythm of the presencing, changing the division. It needs to be changeable, and that has to do with fractality as well. Body map, we know, is outside the body. It is usually shown this way, to be 1.5 meters around from center. I'm thinking of the Da Vinci Man. It's very similar actually, but that doesn't have to be. It could be much further away. Susanne Froebel has a brilliant example of a man where he got stuck in something that was a bit too far away. His interface had a division that was static, which is the first wall, and the second one, it was not within good range. He actually thought that he controlled the sun, and that could happen. And it changes between people and cultures, and it seems if you think your body is ending by the skin, you will have problem moving, because you need to take in a lot more for an easy and balanced movement. Therefore, we also need to deconstruct, and I think that's brilliant. It's so close to Derrida. We need to sort of deconstruct the idea of this limit. This is a persistent model of the body, and that is the idea that our body stops by the skin. That's a new idea. It wasn't common before the Renaissance, and I don't think it became common until the early 19th century. Today it's illegit to say, oh, I, or something like that, if you try to hit me and you miss me nearly. That was always the case in the Middle Ages. And throwing or even thrusting a sword against the person very close to him, that was the same as an assault. Didn't matter if it entered the body or not. It shouldn't matter because it is the same thing. And what we construct, what we're trying to construct is a no knowing, I have to write that up, it's a hard one. No knowing, this is actually hard in English. And no knowing body, it's a body where we don't look into the shapes, the surfaces of the body, and we make it shallow. We make it like the objects. We let our awareness shine on it very briefly and very, very thin. And that gives a reflection. Once more, it's the mirror reflection. And you get the idea that your body ends with your skin, which is a disaster actually. And this is a most persistent idea, perception / gestalt. It needs to be worked with on a daily basis. Taking in space, it's very helpful because you expand when you do that. And the expansion is vivid, usually goes over the chest, and you see this forward thrust coming on. And being in this condition, taking in everything around me, makes me more aware so to speak. And it's a non-biased awareness. It's an open awareness. And then all of a sudden I can approach the thing I want to study or learn about in quite a different way. We could actually call, I think that's a good idea, this skin deep or skin dividing body could we call the ego idea. Something that is not of the world but is constructed from my, I would say, pretensions or ideas about what do other people see, so to speak. And once more, it's the mirror image. I sort of think, I think it's a bit like this. I think when I look into the mirror, I forget that that's a mirror, that's a piece that reflects things. And then I start thinking, what other people see is what I see in the mirror. And there you have the problem. There's a definite problem. And this is also problematically enough self-confirming. So the very mode of confirming that this is reality I have perceived in this really limited way, the very limitation, the boredom, the repetitionness of the whole thing, the blandness, that is the stamp of reality these days. And that becomes self-confirmatory. The whole principle, because there is no interaction, nothing or very little from the fractality of the text, of the world, or whatever it is, will actually come over. Because only fractality that is activated, turned towards, will be able to take in. And this is coming from Ramachandran. He talks about the echo, and this is very similar to how a bat works. It is a bit shocking because a bat localize object and also orient itself by sending out signals to the surrounding areas. And when they come back, the bat will know the distance, the direction, also in some way the density of the things around it because of the echoing thing. I was really amazed when I heard about this the first time when I was a teenager, maybe on telly. So fantastic. Sometimes you can even hear that sound. If you still have a keen hearing, you will hear it late at night. It's a very, very high-pitched noise. And there is loads of bat here in the city, so you can hear it everywhere. And they are trying to get around. And when I heard that, I thought, oh my God, that is really different. And now, for the second time, I read Ramachandran and also what Mintzinger writes. In neurology, normal hearing is not that different at all. There are more neurons going to the ears and from the ears. It's an active fractality going on. And without that active ingredient, there won't be hearing. Our hearing is like our eyesight and also our smell, a dual thing. And more action always goes out. So it's a doing. We do things. And now it makes much more sense with the idea that the reader signs the book, so to speak. It's not only the author, it's a mutual doing. And it's also a sort of taking in a multi-dimensional level, because this shallow thing I mentioned before has a fourth trait, and that is that it's very surface-like. It doesn't have any dimension to it. Actually, it's very similar to the idea of the left hemisphere in Ian McGilchrist. His idea is that the left hemisphere is dominating today when it comes to reading. He started in literature and poems, and he was shocked, abhorred how the poems were read these days. They were killed more or less, and he felt almost like a nausea from hearing it. And this shallow reading is caused by ideas about how the world is working, perceptions, even I would say precepts. And for me, that was also the case until rather recently, I would say. And I start to understand there are several levels to everything, and they can all be true at the same time. And they can even be contradictory, because in fractality, what is correct on one level could be incorrect on another level. That is completely natural when it comes to fractality. Actually, it's more common than not. The world wasn't made to be non-contradictory. Nobody wrote up the law of the excluded middle when the reality came into being. This way of deconstruction of text, I would say, both from a fractal way or the common deconstructive way, will make it possible for it to have both width and depth. And this depth is a true depth. This is not a metaphor for depth, as my literature professor used to say, depth in the text. Now I understand it to be quite literary. It has a measurable depth. And this is something that Mentzinger, third person mentioned by Froebel, mentions in several cases. These days, when we look into precepts, perception, we look also at the depth. And this is also what Susie Froebel did with time. Time is duration, but it's also a depth. And the depth is most important. Otherwise, it'd be very hard to go in the rhythm of the external time. So the now is very problematic in that instance. In this case, when it comes to autobiography, Derrida wants to show that participation is part of the process of listening or hearing. The ear is a participatory thing, just like other things that we have. And he exposes what one could call an originary breach in the interiority of oneself, but also in the autobiographer. And he demonstrates that the entanglement, I like that word, entanglement, of self and alterity. Alterity is the other. And the entanglement of the self and the alterity disrupts the desire for self-presence in autobiography. So it becomes a chasm. So self-identity doesn't become possible. And this is a good thing, because when you get difference, you also get presence. Presence is difference, and the opposite also whole. Fractality is actually literal difference. It's always different, but it's also iterating itself on every level. So you can think about this like the matryoshka, but you add some tubings to them, and then you show that they are interactive. And if you have the text as one matryoshka and you have yourself as another matryoshka, these two will in their turn interact with each other. It's a sort of an embrace. This is something written by Lee Gilmore, and she writes a little comment about this text. I like it. While on the one hand, most traditional critics of autobiography have sought to argue for autobiography's generic coherence and historical continuity in order to win some space in tightly contested arena of literary studies. Many postmoderns' explorations, on the other hand, seeks to do away with the definitional heft and limits provided by the genre theory. This can be translated to that the old model was a little bit that you look at the world from the ego perspective, you have the objects, and the objects directly get their lineage, their origin. They were born at some instance. There is a link, like a bead, of causal connections. This happens in an instance like this, and this is also what is done within current literary science, and that is to bring the autobiography or any other text into context, history, and similar things to get that text to be credible, real, so many different things. And they want to construct reality from what the ego already done somehow. It's very similar, and it's very telling how the normal constructs actually works. And this is not what Susie Frobel is showing, not at all. Here in the interface, we don't look for some exogenous explanation from what we really are perceiving. Nothing goes beyond experience in this one. You don't have some other way of showing if your experience is real. You experience. That's it. And it's not a small thing anymore. It used to be a very small thing, so small that we had to put on some add-ons, some supplement or whatever you call them. And that was the stamp of original, stamp also of authenticity, that it's the true person who writes the autobiography and it really happened to him or her or them or whatever it was. And the circumstances are correct in some way, either psychologically or physiologically, sociologically or historically. And no, we can do it much better than that. We can actually interact with the text as it is, as we do with the world. It's just that we need to loosen up some limits that are already in place when we start. So we do it another way. And in the beginning it's tough. I can say nothing else. It's really tough. But after a while it gets easier and easier, because it's knowledge that's seeping in. And you can almost say that the old way of doing it, it's a bit uncertain. It's like they don't know if they really experience what they experience. So they need proof of it somehow. And that proof could be that authenticity, original, and proven by many other people, and so forth and so forth. And you end up in this long chain of proofs or whatever they are, because you're so uncertain yourself. Nothing is stronger than experience. This is a good message, and it's coming from partly from neurology, it's coming from fractality as it works, pointing to a world of participation. Isn't that a good idea? Well, I think it's a good time as ever to end here. I say thank you very much, and I wish you a very pleasant evening. Bye bye.
Fantastic. Thank you.